Should you run a lower temp thermostat or just remove the thermostat altogether? Let's talk about it. All right, everyone, thanks once again for joining me. Over the last couple years, I have gotten this question, I don't know how many times. People asking me if they should take their thermostats out, people asking me if they should run a 160-degree thermostat. There seems to be a lot of confusion over exactly what this does. I've even had people that went off on me in the comment section because they asked me this question and didn't like the answer. So we're going to go over that today. And I want to put out a disclaimer before I even start. Yes, this is going to be one of those videos where I break it down Barney style, because I'm just going to assume if you're watching this, you know nothing whatsoever about the cooling system. So if you're one of those guys that likes to complain about me going on too long and going into too much detail on stuff, you might want to go ahead and tune out now. On the other hand, if you're contemplating running a 160 or 180 thermostat, or taking your thermostat out altogether because you're overheating and you think it's going to help, you might want to stick around because I'm going to explain this in as much detail as I possibly can. So I am going to put this video in the LS Swap Tips playlist on this channel, but what I'm telling you right now is going to pretty much apply to any engine. Now, if you grew up poor like I did, then chances are you saw your uncle, your dad, your grandpa, somebody in your childhood had an overheating vehicle and decided to just remove the thermostat. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it made the problem worse, and that's kind of what I'm going to go over today, kind of show you why it may have helped, why it may have not helped, and why it may have just made things worse. So before I can explain why removing the thermostat or running a lower temp thermostat is a good or bad idea, first we need to have a fundamental idea of how the cooling system works on a vehicle in the first place, okay? So over here we have your engine. Here we go. We got some valve covers. Here's a carburetor. For all you carburetor guys, even though we're not talking about carburetors here, we'll LS it. We'll put some plug wires. Anyway, this is your engine. Now, on the front of your engine, you have your water pump. That's goofy, but that's going to be our water pump. All right. Now, depending on what engine you have, we're talking about an LS, so you're going to have your thermostat. I'm just going to put a T here. That's our thermostat. It's in the end of our water pump. If you got a small block Chevy, it's going to be up here. You get the picture. Same function, okay? You got hoses. All right. You got on the LS, the bottom hose is the inlet hose. The top hose is the outlet. All right. And over here you got your radiator and you got your cooling fan, which we're not even going to talk about right now. I may get into that a little later, but it's totally irrelevant for what I'm about to tell you, okay? So here's your radiator, okay? So the first misconception that a lot of people have is that the purpose of the thermostat is to let hot coolant out of the engine. That is not the purpose of the thermostat. The purpose of the thermostat is actually to let cool coolant back into the engine while at the same time getting the hot coolant out of the engine. All right, that's very important. So basically what happens is, let's say you have a 195 thermostat in your engine. Again, we're doing the whole LS thing. That's what they come with. Actually, I think the LS comes with like a 197 thermostat from the factory. Oh God, I'm going to get too technical, but they actually had an option where you could opt for a 187 thermostat in some performance applications. We're going to go with 197. So here's what happens. The thermostat is closed, so there is no coolant flowing from the radiator to the engine. There's no coolant flowing out from the engine to the radiator, right? Right. So what happens is when the engine reaches 197-ish, we're going to put ish because no thermostat is perfect. When it reaches 197-ish degrees, this thermostat here is going to open. when the thermostat opens, whatever air is in this radiator, no matter what temperature that whatever coolant is in that radiator, no matter what temperature that coolant is, it's coming into the engine once that thermostat opens, right? This is very important. Remember this. It does not matter how hot this coolant is in your radiator. Once this thermostat opens, that coolant is coming into the engine, all right? And when that coolant comes into the engine, whatever coolant was in the engine, which we're assuming is at least 197 degrees, that's getting pumped back into the radiator, right? So here's the idea. The idea is that the coolant in the radiator is hopefully cooler than 197 degrees. That way, when it comes back into the engine, it cools the engine down a little bit, right? And the coolant that's coming out of the engine goes into the radiator to do what? To be cooled down, all right? Here's the purpose of that thermostat. Guys, the purpose of this thermostat, as I said earlier, is not to let this hot coolant out, or not just to let this hot coolant out. The purpose of this thermostat is to allow the coolant that's in the radiator to have enough time to cool down so that when it comes into the engine, it can cool the engine down. All right, that's the whole purpose of it. This coolant has to stay in the radiator long enough to cool down. Now you can decrease the cool down time with your cooling fan. All right, remember I said it wasn't really relevant to what I'm telling you right now. In a way, it kind of is. But the fact of the matter is, let's say, all right, let's go over this first. Let's go over the first part, all right? Let's assume that you just remove the thermostat altogether, okay? So you take your thermostat completely out. Now, if you take that thermostat out, what's happening? I'll tell you what's happening. What's happening is if you take the thermostat out, you have a constant cycle of coolant going through the engine, through the radiator, through the engine, it never stops. This pump is pumping coolant through this cycle the entire time you're driving. Now, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Well, it kind of depends on the circumstance. 99% of the time it's going to be a bad thing, and here's why. Let's assume for a second that you have a really efficient radiator and fan setup, okay? And let's assume that you have a car that's got a lot of grill area up here, so you got tons of air coming through that radiator all the time. In that situation, what's usually going to happen is the coolant is just, the engine's never going to warm up, guys. And a lot of this depends on ambient temperature outside. If you're driving this car around and there's no thermostat and the radiator works really good and it's like 40 degrees outside, this engine is never going to warm up because the coolant is not going to stay in the radiator long enough to, well, the coolant's not going to stay in the engine long enough to warm up, but because the radiator is super efficient in our scenario and it's cold outside, it's never, you know, it's just never going to warm up. The engine's going to get up to about 120, 130 degrees. It's going to be continuously pumping it through the radiator, which is cooling the coolant down and pumping it right back through the engine. It's just never going to get warm. So what you're going to have there is in the wintertime, you're going to have no freaking heat. You're going to think, dang, this engine runs really cool, man. I'm glad I took this thermostat out. Now, let's change the temperature outside. Let's say you're driving around, and again, you've got a really efficient radiator, and the temperature is, say, 75 or 80 degrees out, okay? In that situation, you might have thought you did some good because in that situation, the engine's probably warming the coolant and it's not really getting super cooled in the radiator because the ambient temp's higher outside. So, you know, it's maybe allowing the engine to get up to 170, 180 degrees or whatever, and you've just constantly got this cycle going. And at this point, you're thinking, man, removing that thermostat was the best thing I ever did, right? Okay, now let's assume all of a sudden you have a heat wave, okay? And you're somewhere where you're in freaking Arizona, and it's 105, 110 degrees. Now guess what's happening? Now what's happening is the engine is warming this coolant up. It's going through the radiator, but it's not staying in the radiator long enough to get cooled down because it's so hot outside, and it's just passing through the radiator real quickly. Then you've removed your thermostat, and it's going to cause an overheating condition, okay? So that kind of shows you this scenario with an efficient radiator. Now let's talk about if you don't have an efficient radiator. Let's assume your radiator sucks, your cooling fan ain't working, and your engine seems to be running a little hot, so Joe Blow, daddy-in-law, told you to pull your thermostat out, because that's what he used to do on his 1972 El Camino, right? So you go ahead, you pull your thermostat out. Your radiator ain't worth a snot. It's all half clogged up. Your fan don't work. It's 60 degrees outside, but guess what? It don't matter. You're still overheating because the coolant can't stay in the radiator long enough to cool down. It's getting warm in the engine. It's getting pumped straight through the radiator without having time to cool down and straight back into the engine, but it's still hot because the radiator didn't do squat, right? Because it was only in the radiator for like 5 seconds. So then it gets hotter in the engine, goes through the radiator, gets hotter, and every time it pumps through, it's getting hotter and hotter. You get about 10 miles down the road, you're overheating, okay? So hopefully that kind of makes clear why you don't want to remove the thermostat. In a functioning engine, again, what happens is the engine's going to get to 197-ish degrees. It's going to pump the coolant into your radiator. While the coolant in the engine is getting back up to 197 degrees, the coolant gets to sit in the radiator because the thermostat has closed again. So the radiator and the cooling fans have time to cool it off before it gets pumped back into the engine. All right? That's what you want to happen. I think I'm yelling, but it's because I'm cold. I don't know. It's either because I'm cold or it's because I'm just getting sick of, answering this question 50,000 times. So, anyway, now let's go to a new scenario, okay? We've got our engine again. And again, we've got our radiator. We've got our water pump. Goofy looking. We've got our thermostat. And here's our top hose. And here's our bottom hose again. And here's our cooling fan again. All right? So, I cannot draw. I know. You don't have to tell me. Anyway, we've already determined why it's a bad idea to remove the thermostat. So just to recap again, depending on the ambient temperature of the air outside, it may or may not seem to help. But the fact of the matter is, if your car was overheating and removing the thermostat helped it, then there's a pretty good chance that either A, it's just a really cool time of year, or B, you just needed to replace the thermostat. Your thermostat was just messed up, and that was your problem to begin with. So instead of removing it, you should just replace it with one that you know works, okay? Now, scenario 2, this is controversial a lot of the times. We're going to talk about a 160-degree thermostat, okay? You can run a 180. Some people even make 170s. We're going to talk about a 160 because that's the most common question I get asked. And the main thing I get asked about is, can I run a 160-degree thermostat on my fuel-injected engine? Is it going to mess it up? Is it going to make any power? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, we'll cover that first, all right? A lot of people are under the misconception that if you put a 160-degree thermostat in a modern fuel-injected engine like an LS, that it's going to screw with the fueling, it's going to screw with the timing, all kinds of stuff. Here's the fact of the matter. In most fuel enrichment tables in an LS engine, when you're talking about the stock PCM, I'm not talking about Holley and all that. It's all adjustable, but the way it comes from the factory, most of them that I've looked at, they don't really start, messing with the timing too much or messing with the fueling unless the engine is under 140 degrees. Some of them, it's even lower. Some of them, I think it's like 120. I'm trying to remember what it was on the China Vet. I think the China Vet was around 140. Some trucks, I think, are around 120. So the point of that is a 160 degree thermostat isn't really going to mess with your fuel tables or your timing too much. Okay. The computer will enrich a little bit at 160, but what you want to keep in mind is that it is enriching to help it. It's not like it's going to a whole different table. Okay. It might just put like 1% more fuel or something in because the engine's cold, and if it doesn't, it's going to run a little lean. Okay. But if you're doing a modification like this, chances are it's because you've done a bunch of other modifications too, and you're probably going to have it tuned. So yeah, fact of the matter is 160 is probably not going to hurt anything horsepower wise. And if everything's tuned correctly, running the engine a little bit cooler may actually help you to make some power by allowing you to put more timing in without worrying about, detonation, knock, retard, things like that. Cooler generally allows you to, run a little more timing. That's why we use intercoolers. That's why we use, air to water intercoolers, things like that. Anyway, what a 160 degree thermostat can do is exhibit some of the same signs as not running a thermostat at all. So here's our scenario again, guys. The main problem with running a 160 degree thermostat is if your cooling system is not efficient enough to run at 160 degrees. Okay? Now what I mean by that is, in this scenario, we now have a 160 degree thermostat, right? So what's going to happen when the engine gets to 160 degrees, the thermostat is going to open, and it's going to allow whatever coolant is in the radiator. Again, remember, the thermostat don't care what temperature the coolant is in the radiator. It cares what it is in the engine. So it's going to let that coolant in from the radiator. It's going to push the 160 degree coolant out to the radiator. That's all fine and dandy, right? You think everything's good. The problem lies in if your cooling system is not capable of maintaining 160 degree or cooler temps. Okay? And I'm going to tell you right now, most factory cooling systems in like normal, 80 degree outside ambient temperatures, most factory cooling systems are not capable of maintaining a 160 degree temperature in an engine. Okay? So what you start seeing is similar to what you saw when you took the thermostat out altogether. Because the coolant in the radiator never gets down to 160 or never gets below 160 degrees, when it gets pumped into the engine, the thermostat never closes because the coolant that's in the radiator is already hotter than 160 degrees. And it starts a cycle where the coolant starts getting warmer and warmer. And since this thermostat stays open the whole time, it just keeps building more and more heat and more heat and more heat. Now, a lot of people will try to compensate for that by running the fans more. They'll pull the fans down to where they stay on, at 160 degrees. In a situation where you're running 160 degree thermostat, generally what I want to do is I want to turn the fans on at about 170 and off at 160. Okay? Well, what you'll start seeing people do here is they'll have the fans come on at 160 and go off at like 150, which basically means they never go off because they're not capable of cooling down. Guys, you need to have a very, very efficient cooling system to run a 160 degree thermostat. All right. As a matter of fact, a lot of times, and my buddy Zane, I was talking to Zane about this the other day, and he was, because I said in the last video, I was thinking about trying the 160 degree thermostat and chaos theory that he sent me. And so he actually texted me and he was telling me, he's like, yeah, generally when I would run that in all my cars, they would run at about 180 or 185 degrees. That's because the cooling systems were not efficient enough. If they were, those cars would have been running at 160 degrees because it's a 160 degree thermostat. But that's the problem, I'm telling you guys. If your cooling system cannot keep your engine at 160 degrees, then you probably shouldn't run a 160 degree thermostat, because what you could find happening, and again, this will be ambient air sensitive. In colder weather, it might be capable of maintaining 160 degrees. You get up to regular, 75, 80 degree summer days, and you might start seeing that it runs a little warmer than that. It might start running 170, 180 degrees. That's a warning sign, because if you've got a 160 degree thermostat and it's 80 degrees outside, and you're already seeing 180 degrees in your engine temps, that's a warning sign that you don't want to be driving this car if you have a really hot day and it gets up to 95 or 100, because what's going to happen is it's just going to get hotter and hotter and hotter, because the coolant is not going to stay in the radiator. The same problem we had with the pulling the thermostat out altogether, and it's just gradually going to get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter until it overheats. Okay, so this is why I said in my last video that I actually prefer to run a 180, because most well-maintained factory cooling systems are capable of running at 180 or 185 degrees. It's kind of an in-between point between the 160 and the 197, and it allows your cooling system to operate properly, point blank. Now, you can argue with this logic all you want. It doesn't change the facts. This is how your cooling system works. This is how your cooling system reacts when you take the thermostat out or you run a lower temp thermostat. That's just how it is, guys. Now, I've talked about, running the lower temp thermostat. And again, guys, if you have a coolant system that'll do it, by all means, go for a 160 degree thermostat. I will tell you this though, in the wintertime, if this is a daily driver, your heat is going to suck, because 160 degree engine temps usually means, lukewarm heater. Okay. So that's going to suck in the wintertime if your car is actually capable of maintaining that temperature. Okay. I would steer you more towards a 180. All right, if you want to run a cooler thermostat, I would steer you more towards a 180. But keep in mind, if your car is overheating and you pull the thermostat out, or you put another thermostat in it and the car stops overheating, you probably didn't need a lower temp thermostat. You probably didn't need to take it out. Like I said earlier, you probably just needed to replace it. All right. So if you're trying to, my point is, if you're trying to get rid of the thermostat, or you're trying to go to a lower temp thermostat because you're having overheating problems, you need to figure out why it's overheating. Okay, it's either your thermostat's bad and you can get away with just putting your regular 197 back in it, or you've got another problem here. And trust me, if you put one of these in it or you remove it altogether, the first warm day outside, you're going to figure out that the thermostat wasn't your problem. Okay, so my suggestion is identify the problem and go from there. But yeah, if you're doing this for performance, I personally recommend a 180. Okay, very rarely would I recommend a 160. I'm about to use a 160 on this car because Zane was nice enough to send us one, so we're going to try it out and see what happens with the new aluminum radiator. But I generally do not recommend going that low. Now, is there a situation where I would recommend removing the thermostat? Yeah. If you know your thermostat's stuck and you're on the side of the highway and, you're 50, 60 miles from home and you just want to get the dang car home, yeah, by all means, pull the thermostat out. And then, if you make it home, once you get home, put a new one in it. Okay? It's that simple. The only time I would recommend permanently not running a thermostat, and I know a lot of guys do this, is if you're running an electric water pump. Okay, because if you're running an electric water pump, you've probably either got your computer, be it a Holley or a Fast EFI, whatever you're running, you've probably got that pump acting as the thermostat. And what I mean by that is, most people, when they run an electric water pump, it does not run the whole time the engine's running. They're either using a switch that screws into the cylinder head, like a same thing you would use in a fan, electric fan setup, or they're using the computer to turn that pump on whenever the engine reaches a certain temperature. So it's kind of acting, you know, just like a thermostat, you know. So, you know, there's no thermostat, but the pump's not pumping. So the coolant's not circulating. When the engine reaches, you know, say they've got it set to 175 degrees, okay? That's the cool thing about an electric pump. You can do stuff like that. So when the engine hits 175 degrees, the computer turns the electric water pump on, and it circulates the coolant through until the engine, you know, doesn't see whatever temp. They may have it set to turn off at 160, okay? So it'll circulate through, and as long as the coolant coming in is 160 degrees, it'll shut the water pump back off again until the engine warms back up to 175. Then it'll turn it back on, and that's the cycle. In that case, you don't need a thermostat because, you know, the water pump is blocking water flow and holding the water in the radiator, you know, until the computer tells it to turn on. So, you who were asking about this, who have asked me about it in the past, and who will ask me about it in the future, hopefully this answers your question. Hopefully it gives you kind of an idea of how all this works, why you would or wouldn't want to put a lower temp thermostat in or remove the thermostat altogether. If this video did help you out, make sure you hit that thumbs up button, share the video with a friend or with a group of friends, whatever you want to do. If you're looking for more LS Swap tech tips, make sure you check out the LS Swap tech tips playlist on this channel. Then get out in the garage, get something done, and I'll see you next time here on Bad Luck Garage.